Listen, I need to tell you this because if I don't get it out, I'm going to lose my mind. And you're the only one I trust not to call your the lies. You know how I moved out to that research station in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest last January? I told everyone back in Boston it was for the peace and quiet, a chance for a software engineer like me to finally squash the bugs in that telemetry suite without the city noise. But I never told you about the sound I heard on the third night, did I? Or why I left my customized 74 Bronco, the one I spent 3 years restoring, abandoned in a snowbank near Mount Adams? Have you ever felt like the woods weren't just empty, but were actually waiting for you to realize you were being watched? They say the Pacific Northwest is beautiful in the winter, but they don't tell you about the things that blend into the birch trees and the frozen mist. My name is Elias Johnson, and I'm lucky to be speaking to you right now, though I still can't sleep without a light on. The job was simple enough. I was contracted by a private firm to maintain the remote sensory nodes that monitor geological shifts around the Cascades. My wife Sandra and our 7-year-old Georgie stayed back in our brownstone. The plan was for me to pull a 6-week solo stint and come back with enough of a bonus to pay off the mortgage. I remember the day I arrived. It was an unnervingly sunny Tuesday, the kind of bright, cold day where the snow reflects the light so harshly it makes your head ache. The air was thin and tasted like iron. I parked the Bronco at the base of the ridge, about 40 miles from the nearest paved road, and hiked the last mile into the station. It was a reinforced A-frame cabin, packed with servers, a satellite uplink, and enough canned rations to survive a small apocalypse. Just you and the trees, Elias, I told myself as I checked the perimeter. But the trees didn't look right. Some of the older hemlocks had their bark stripped off in long, vertical gouges, way too high up to be a bear. The first few days were mundane, mostly just checking lines and coding by the warmth of a kerosene heater. But on the fourth night, the sunny weather broke into a silent, heavy snowfall that seemed to swallow all sound. I was sitting at my desk when the first sensory node, Node 4, located about 300 yards north, tripped its motion alarm. On the monitor, the infrared feed showed nothing but the gray blur of falling flakes. Then, the camera lens was suddenly obscured by something dark and matted. It wasn't an animal's face. It looked like a wall of filthy, frozen hair. I watched paralyzed as the heavy steel casing of the node, bolted to a tree 6 feet off the ground, was wrenched upward with a screech of shearing metal that echoed through my speakers. Something was out there that didn't just want to see the equipment, it wanted to break it. I grabbed my headlamp and my old Remington 870, the one my dad gave me before I left Massachusetts, and stepped onto the porch. The silence of the forest was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight. I called out, "Hello?" But the word just died in the cold air. That's when I smelled it. A stench like wet dog, mixed with rotting skunk cabbage and something metallic, like old blood. I panned my light toward the tree line, and for a split second, 2 amber orbs caught the reflection. They were massive, spaced too far apart for any wolf or cougar, and they were at least 8 feet off the ground. They didn't blink, they just slid sideways into the shadows, moving with a fluid, heavy grays that defied the deep snow. I went back inside and locked the deadbolt, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the shotgun. I remembered that old documentary I saw as a kid, the one about the wild man of the woods, and I realized with a sickening jolt that this wasn't a legend. It was standing in my backyard. Sleep was a joke after that. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the A-frame, the Remington across my lap, watching the monitors until the sun finally burned through the mountain mist. Even with the bright morning light reflecting off the fresh powder, the forest felt claustrophobic, like the trees were leaning in just a little closer than they had been yesterday. I knew I should leave right then, just pack the gear and hike back to the Bronco, but I kept thinking about Sandra and Georgie back in Boston. If I walked away now, I'd forfeit the contract and we'd lose the house. I couldn't let my fear be the reason my son lost his bedroom. So I did what any rational man does when he's terrified. I tried to rationalize the impossible. Maybe it was a rogue grizzly, I told myself, though I knew grizzlies in the Cascades were rare, and they sure as hell didn't stand 8 feet tall in the dead of winter. Around noon, I forced myself to head out to Node 04 to assess the damage. The snow was pristine, except for the path I was carving, until I got within 50 yards of the site. That's when I saw the tracks. They weren't paw prints, they were elongated, 5-toed impressions, nearly 16 inches long, sunk deep into the crust of the snow. The stride was impossible. Each step was nearly 5 feet apart. My heart started drumming against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. When I reached the tree where the note had been, my stomach dropped. The steel housing hadn't just been broken, it had been twisted like a soda can. Bits of glass and silicon were scattered in the red-stained snow, and that's when I realized the red wasn't rust from the casing. Something had bled here, or more likely something had brought a kill here to mark its territory. I knelt to examine a tuft of hair caught in the jagged metal of the mound. It was coarse, reddish-brown, and smelled of wood smoke and old musk. As I touched it, the forest went deadly silent. You know that feeling when the birds and the insects just stop? It's like the world holds its breath. Then from the ridge above me came a sound that I still hear every time I close my eyes. It wasn't a roar, and it wasn't a howl. It was a whoop, a high-pitched, resonant vocalization that sounded like a woman screaming through a hollow log. It was answered instantly by a deeper, chest-thumping from the woods directly behind me. There wasn't just one of them. I was being flanked. I didn't run. Running triggers the predatory response, or at least that's what I remember from those survival forums I used to browse back home. I backed away slowly, keeping the shotgun leveled at the tree line, my eyes darting between the shadows. "I'm leaving," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm going now." A heavy rock, the size of a grapefruit, whistled past my head and slammed into the trunk of the hemlock next to me with enough force to shatter the bark. They weren't just watching anymore, they were testing me. I made it back to the cabin porch, fumbling with the keys, and as I turned to lock the door, I saw a massive shape break cover from the north. It didn't run on all fours, it sprinted upright, its long arms swinging in a powerful, rhythmic motion. It was a Sasquatch. the shape, and it was closing the distance faster than any human athlete could dream of. I slammed the door and threw the bolt just as a heavy thud shook the entire A-frame, making the rafters groan. The cabin didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a cage. That thud wasn't a random impact. It was a deliberate strike, a test of the structure's integrity. I stood in the center of the room, breath coming in ragged gasps, watching the heavy timber door vibrate as something leaned its weight against the other side. You have to understand, these A-frames are built to withstand snow loads of thousands of pounds, but the way the wood was creaking made me feel like I was inside a matchbox. I reached for the satellite phone, my fingers slick with cold sweat, only to find the no signal icon blinking mockingly back at me. The uplink, the dish on the roof, they must have ripped it out when they hit the roof. I was completely cut off, 40 miles into the frozen Cascades, with at least two of these things circling my coordinates. Then the screaming started. Not from the creatures, but from the monitors. The audio feed from Node 7, half a mile out, was broadcasting a series of rhythmic, metallic clangs, like a hammer hitting an anvil. They were communicating, using my own equipment as drums to signal to each other across the valley. I realized then that they weren't just animals. There was a tactical intelligence here that chilled me worse than the winter wind. I started moving, fueled by a shot of pure adrenaline, grabbing my hiking pack and shoving in every flare, every box of shelves, and heavy-duty bear spray I'd laughed at when I bought it in Seattle. I knew if I stayed until nightfall, they'd find a way in, through the skylight or by simply tearing the door off its hinges. Think, Elias, think, I hissed to myself, the image of Sandra and George's faces flashing in my mind like a dying light bulb. I had a backup plan, something I'd prepped because of my obsession with old cars. I'd rigged a small, portable radio to a long-range antenna I'd built from the Bronco, and if I could get to the ridge line, I might be able to jumpstart the signal. But as I approached the window to check the perimeter, the glass suddenly exploded inward. A massive charcoal-colored hand, thick with matted fur and tipped with blunt, powerful black nails, reached through the shards. It didn't grab for me. It grabbed the heavy oak kitchen table and dragged it toward the window with a terrifying, effortless strength. It was clearing the path. I didn't hesitate. I leveled the Remington and fired. The roar of the 12 gauge in the small cabin was deafening, a physical blow to my eardrums. The creature let out a sound I can only describe as a bark, low, percussive and full of genuine shock. It retreated from the window, and I saw a spray of dark, thick fluid coat the snow outside. I didn't wait for a second shot. I kicked the back door open, the one leading toward the steep ravine, hoping they'd expect me to go for the main trail. The cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't feel it. I began to slide and scramble down the icy slope, the sound of the cabin being systematically dismantled, echoing behind me in the bright, mocking sunlight. I had 4 miles of deep powder between me and the Bronco, and I could hear the whooping starting again, closer this time. My lungs were burning, each breath feeling like I was swallowing broken glass. The descent down the ravine was a blur of adrenaline and sheer terror. I must have tumbled 50 feet at one point, my shoulder slamming into a frozen cedar, but I didn't feel the pain. Not yet. I reached the bottom of the gorge where the creek was a solid vein of black ice. And that's when I heard the heavy, rhythmic thumps of something keeping pace with me on the ridge above. It wasn't trying to hide anymore, it was hurting me. You ever play with a mouse before you finish it? That's what this felt like. I looked up and saw it, a second creature, smaller than the first but leaner, more agile, silhouetted against the blinding sun on the crest of the hill. It let out a low, vibrating growl that I felt in my teeth. I knew I couldn't outrun them in the deep drifts, so I made for the boneyard, an area of the forest where a localized microburst had knocked down hundreds of trees years ago. It was a graveyard of bleached, tangled timber, a nightmare to navigate, but perfect for a man with a shotgun who needed to narrow the field of vision. As I scrambled over a massive fallen fir, my boot slipped, wedging my leg between two trunks. Panic, cold and sharp, surged through me. I yanked, but I was stuck fast. Behind me, the brush exploded. The larger one, the one I'd shot at the cabin, emerged from the tree line. Its shoulder was matted with dark frozen gore where the buckshot had penetrated it. In its face, God, its face was almost human, but stretched with a heavy brow and eyes that held a hateful, ancient intelligence. It didn't rush. It picked up a fallen branch the size of a baseball bat and began to strip the smaller limbs of it, watching me the whole time. It was showing me what it was going to do. I fumbled for the Remington, but it had fallen just out of reach when I slipped. "Stay back," I screamed, reaching into my vest for the only thing I had left, the industrial bear spray. The creature took a step, its massive weight cracking a 3-inch thick branch like a toothpick. It let out a roar that wasn't a whoop this time. It was a guttural, chest-shaking sound of pure, unadulterated rage. As it lunged, I didn't aim for the body. I aimed for those massive, unblinking amber eyes and emptied the entire canister of capsaicin into the air. The orange mist hung in the cold, still air like a toxic cloud. The Sasquatch hit the cloud and stopped dead, its massive hands flying to its face. It let out a sound I can only describe as a strangled shriek, thrashing blindly and smashing its club into the logs around me. The smell was overwhelming, hot pepper and musk, and it gave me the surge of desperate strength I needed to wrench my leg free, leaving my boot behind in the crevice. I grabbed the Remington, ignored the screaming pain in my ankle, and began to crawl, then limp, then run toward the clearing where I'd hidden the Bronco. I could hear the second one, the scout, screaming from the ridge, a high-pitched alarm that told me my window of escape was closing in seconds. The sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, and I knew if I was still on foot when the shadows lengthened, I was a dead man. I burst into the clearing where the Bronco sat, a lone island of rusted steel in a sea of white. My breath was coming in ragged sobbing hitches now, and my sock-covered foot was completely numb from the snow. I didn't look back. I knew they were right behind the curtain of hemlocks. I dived into the driver's seat, fumbling the keys with fingers that felt like frozen sausages. The engine groaned, the cold oil thick as molasses, but that 302 V8 was my pride and joy for a reason. It roared to life just as a massive weight slammed into the rear quarter panel, rocking the 3-ton truck like it was a toy. I threw it into reverse, the tires screaming for traction on the ice, and caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of the Scout leaping onto the hood. Its face was pressed against the windshield, flat nose, yellowish teeth, and eyes that looked like burning coals. It began to pound on the glass, each strike spiderwebbing the safety glass. I didn't think, I just floored it. The Bronco surged backward, slamming into a stand of saplings, and the creature lost its footing, sliding off the hood with a snarl of frustration. I slammed it into first gear, the four-wheel drive biting into the frozen dirt beneath the snow, and tore down the narrow logging trail. Branches whipped against the sides like gunfire, but I didn't let up. For 3 miles I saw them in the periphery, dark shapes keeping pace through the thickest brush, leaping over fallen logs with a terrifying, effortless athleticism. They followed me all the way to the park boundary, only peeling away when the trees thinned out near the highway. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station in Packwood, 3 towns away. I sat there under the fluorescent lights, shaking so hard I couldn't turn the engine off, watching the blood from my shredded sock drip onto the floor mats. When the attendant came out to ask if I was okay, I couldn't even speak. I just pointed at the side of the Bronco. There were 4 deep, parallel grooves torn into the heavy gauge steel of the door, and the handprint in the frost on the windshield that was twice the size of a man's head. I never went back for my gear, and I told the firm a localized landslide destroyed the station, which wasn't entirely a lie, considering the state they must have left it in. I'm back in Boston now, working a desk job in the seaport where the only wildlife is the occasional seagull. Sandra thinks I just had a bad scare with a bear, and I let her believe it. But sometimes, when the wind howls down the narrow streets between the brownstones, I swear, I hear that rhythmic whooping echoing of the bricks. They say these things have long memories, and I know I'm the only one who ever got a piece of them and lived. Do me a favor, if you ever head out toward Mount Adams, stay in the car, because out there the sun might be shining, but you're never walking alone.